For 29 years after the end of World War II, Lieutenant Hiroo Onoda carried on fighting, refusing to believe that Japan had surrendered. Today, he's often seen as a hero for his dedication to duty and determination to survive against all the odds. But in this video, I'll be uncovering a different story. A real-life apocalypse now of madness and murder that involves communist guerrillas, blood-sucking vampires, and even the possibility that the CIA were helping him. So let's take a journey upriver into the heart of darkness with a new look at the Vampire of Lubang. The Japanese capture of the Philippine Islands in 1942 is still ranked as the worst military defeat in United States history. Tens of thousands of American prisoners of war and even more civilians died through malnutrition, torture, or execution. But despite the crushing invasion, the spirit of the population wasn't broken. A fierce resistance grew up, with deadly guerrilla groups supported and trained by US Special Forces troops. Among them was the People's Army Against Japan, the Hukbalahap, or HUK for short. By 1943, it had around 20,000 men and women fighting, along with another 50,000 in reserve. Slowly, the tide turned, and on the 20th of October 1944, Allied troops led by General Douglas MacArthur and Philippines President Osmeña landed on the eastern island of Leyte to begin a grueling campaign that would claim over 1 million more lives. It was into this battle that 23-year-old Lieutenant Onoda was launched on December the 26th, arriving on the small, insignificant island of Lubang that he wasn't to leave again for 3 decades. As an intelligence officer with a commando unit, Onoda was instructed to delay Allied progress by destroying infrastructure and conducting nuisance raids. He was also given another fateful order by Commanding Officer Major Yoshimi Taniguchi. You are absolutely forbidden to die by your own hand. It may take 3 years, it may take 5, but whatever happens, we'll come back for you. Until then, so long as you have one soldier, you are to continue to lead him. And boy, did Onoda take that to heart. Japanese tactics were to retreat to the mountains and jungles in small cells. So when the Allies reached Lubang on February the 28th, 1945, that's exactly what the lieutenant did, leading Private Yuichi Akatsu, Corporal Shoichi Shimada, and Private First Class Kinshichi Kazuka into the jungle to carry on the fight. War raged across the Philippine Islands until August the 15th, when, after the devastating nuclear strikes on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Emperor Hirohito ordered an immediate ceasefire. Lieutenant Onoda and his men didn't listen. After receiving a hero's welcome on his return to Japan, Onoda wrote a best-selling book telling his side of the story. As far as he was concerned, he said the war never finished, so he just carried on doing his duty, burning local food supplies and attempting to kill the new forces now occupying Lubang. He and his men heard many appeals to stop fighting from local police and villagers. They found leaflets dropped from the air with a direct order to surrender issued by General Tomiyuki Yamashita, Supreme Commander of the Imperial Japanese Army in the Philippines, but dismissed all of it as Allied propaganda. In the jungle, the squad soon settled into a routine, living in a tent and later in caves, moving every few days to avoid capture, and raiding local farms for bananas, rice, and cattle. Not good news for a population trying to recover from years of Japanese occupation. At first, there were a few other troops holding out on the island, but all were soon captured by Allied forces and the local police. The fact that local police and troops did seem to be hunting them, Onoda said, convinced him the war was still raging. As the years went on, former Japanese soldiers and even members of the men's families, including Onoda's own brother, were brought over from Japan to broadcast appeals for them to lay down arms. More dirty Allied tricks, they decided. Onoda thought his brother was an actor, and not a good one. By 1949, though, Private Akatsu had had enough, secretly deserting one night and handing himself in. He too later left notes telling his comrades that it was safe to come out, which they ignored. In 1954, Corporal Shimada died, apparently in a gunfight with local police. Kinshichi Kazuka survived until 1972, before also dying in a gunfight, leaving Onoda to carry on World War II all alone. Realizing that the final soldier could still be alive, a Japanese college dropout named Norio Suzuki travelled to Lubang and, incredibly, tracked him down in just a few days. But still, Onoda refused to give up unless his commanding officer came back for him, as promised all those years earlier. Amazingly, Major Taniguchi was still alive, and Suzuki persuaded him to travel to Lubang and officially relieve Onoda of duty. In an event that turned into a media circus, even notorious Philippine President Ferdinand Marcos was on hand to officially pardon the tattered figure who marched out of the jungle with his head held high, but tears in his eyes. It's this version of the story that made Lieutenant Onoda a legend worldwide, an example of duty, perseverance, and survival like no other. But is it the true story? Lieutenant Onoda was an intelligence officer. His job was to find things out. During his time on the island, he occasionally had access to newspapers and a radio. Surely a soldier with his skills would have figured out the truth that the war was long since over. And certainly, many local people always claimed he knew that was the case. He'd also ignored two direct orders from his supreme commander and his emperor. Did he really believe they were propaganda from the hated Americans? Or was there more to it? Because whether he knew it or not, he was now fighting on the same side as those Americans. It wasn't just Japanese stragglers that the Allied forces were hunting. In fact, they were the least of the problem. Because for the Americans, as one war ended, another was already beginning across Southeast Asia, the war against communism. Despite their heroic role, the HUK, the resistance group that had fought with the US, were now being treated as an enemy too. Their leaders were arrested and charged with treason and sedition, their fighters forcibly disarmed. Barred from the country's new parliament by the US-backed administration and outlawed, the HUK rebelled and also took to the jungle, supported and sheltered by many of the poor farmers and fishermen who were gaining nothing from the new order. But soon, strange reports started emerging from the rural areas where support for the rebels was strongest. The mutilated bodies of HUK fighters were being found dumped by roadsides, their bodies completely drained of blood. Sometimes, as HUK patrols moved along jungle trails, it was said the last fighter in line would quietly disappear, only to be found later, their blood sucked from their body. A magical symbol that locals called the Eye of God was also appearing on houses in the dead of night, identifying the homes of HUK fighters or those who supported them. These people would soon disappear too. For locals, it meant only one thing. The rebels were being hunted by an aswang, a nocturnal vampire creature that lived in the forests, but could assume the shape of a beautiful woman to lure its victims to a messy end, sucking their blood with its long, pointed tongue. And sure enough, the bodies all had wounds on their necks. Just as the legend said, a climate of fear and distrust soon settled across the region. On Lubang too, people were also being found dead, the population living in fear of vampires of their own. Most of the Japanese troops who hid out after World War II were only interested in survival, hiding away as much as possible, their presence often unknown to locals. And according to Hiroo Onoda's book, his group was the same, avoiding contact with anyone and only fighting against police and troops as ordered. But that wasn't true. On March 8, 1951, a 42-year-old farmer named Emilio Viana and his young sons were in the fields of Lubang harvesting sweet potatoes. As they ate lunch, shots rang out from the jungle, one bullet hitting Emilio in the groin and severing an artery. By the time he reached hospital, a boat ride away, Emilio had bled to death. This was just one of at least 30 murders it's claimed Lieutenant Onoda and his followers committed. Not police or troops, not collateral damage of people caught in the crossfire, but deliberate, targeted killings of ordinary islanders, farmers, village chiefs, men and women. Some victims were beheaded, many bodies were mutilated or hacked with a saw. Many other innocent people were deliberately crippled by shots to the knee. There were also many reports of sexual assault. Just like the Aswang vampire, it seemed a vengeful force was targeting local peasants, intent on spreading fear and terror. Onoda and his men, said locals, were killing because they enjoyed it. It's a very different picture to the one Onoda paints in his book, so had something happened to them? Jungle mania is a recognized psychological condition that can bring on paranoia, even hallucinations. After years of stress and isolation, had they literally gone mad? It's possible, but the man who marched out of the jungle after 29 years still appeared totally sane and in command of himself. The brutalizing of innocent civilian populations had always been a hallmark of the Japanese army during World War II. So rather than just hiding, were Onoda and his men still actively fighting to achieve something? If so, what and for who? Across the Philippines, Huk fighters really were being found dead and drained of blood, but not because of a shape-shifting vampire. Unbelievably, they were killed and hung upside down to drain by CIA-backed forces before being dumped in heaps. The idea was the twisted brainchild of an operative named Edward Lansdale, a pioneer of psychological warfare. His tactic of using local superstition to make it seem a vengeful demon was targeting the rebels and their supporters was devastatingly effective, shattering morale and driving a wedge between the Huk and their power base in poor rural communities. And if Lansdale could use a mythical vampire against the Huk and their supporters, then why not use a half-mad Japanese soldier too? There's no evidence that Onoda's team had the active support of the CIA, but his band of holdouts was potentially very useful to them, targeting exactly the same poor farmers and fishermen who'd been sheltering the Huk elsewhere. If there were Huk fighters on Lubang, Lansdale could just rely on Onoda to deal with them without having to waste any of his own resources. And if innocent people got in the way, well, that was war. Perhaps, if nothing else, the CIA made sure Onoda and his men were allowed to stay loose, at least while he thought they could be useful in the new fight against communism. But a man with a mind as twisted as Lansdale's probably wouldn't have hesitated to actively support the Japanese soldiers if he could. It's definitely interesting that after 27 years of supposedly hunting Onoda without success, it took Norio Suzuki, an untrained Japanese hippie, just 4 days to find him and pretty much convince him that the war really was over. If American forces or the CIA had really wanted Onoda's one-man war to end, couldn't they have done that themselves years earlier? The man who returned to a hero's welcome in Japan seemed very different to the merciless killer remembered on Lubang, but found Japan a very different place than he remembered too. claiming the country had forgotten its traditional values and gone soft. He soon left to farm cattle in Brazil, a country that, perhaps not coincidentally, still hosted a good few of Japan's former Nazi allies, with values more in tune to his. Eventually, though, he returned home to open a chain of educational camps for kids, passing on the outdoor skills that he'd learned in the hardest possible way. Controversially, in 1996, he even went back to Lubang to establish a $10,000 scholarship at the local school. His way, he claimed, of saying sorry, though it wasn't an apology that many of the locals accepted. So was Onoda a hero who did his duty to the end, or a villain who killed for fun and may have even been working for the CIA? Perhaps he was both. Lansdale's bizarre PSYOP tactics later developed further in the Vietnam War and were famously featured in the film Apocalypse Now. Maybe Onoda was a real-life forerunner of Colonel Kurtz, another soldier who was lost in the jungle. In this war, things get confused out there. Power, ideals, the old morality, practical military necessity. But out there with these natives, it must be a temptation to be God, because there's a conflict in every human heart between the rational and the irrational, between good and evil, and good does not always triumph. So, let me know what you think in the comments. I've covered more strange stories from World War II in these videos, so check them out. And be sure to like and subscribe to see the latest releases first. Thanks for watching.